المتحدثة الرئيسية التالية هي ملهمة سودانية أمريكية مقيمة في واشنطن وخريجة حديثة من كلية هارفارد، وهي تشارك حالياً في الأعمال المتعلقة بالحرب المستمرة في السودان، مع تركيز بشكل أساسي على الجهود الإنسانية والدبلوماسية، وهي أيضاً جزء من معهد الدوحة للدراسات العليا كمساعد باحث وزميل. تواصل بحثها حول التحول الديمقراطي في السودان بعد الاستقلال ومسارات السودان بعد الصراع للتحول الديمقراطي. المتحدثة الرئيسية التالية هي ريم علي.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. If you ask me where my story begins, I'll tell you that it depends on which part of me you know. It's somewhere between I have a dream and الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, or perhaps between free Palestine and حرية سلام وعدالة مدنية خيار الشعب. No matter where it begins though, I am the product of resistance, and its very essence is ingrained into my bones. I grew up hearing my grandfather tell me the stories of civil rights America, of the freedom fighters, the marches and protests, the revolutionaries who made our lives today possible. At the same time, I also grew up with my mother calling me to watch every Al Jazeera broadcast of the Arab Spring, of the brave civilians and martyrs who decided that regime change was worth putting their lives on the line for. It was in these stories and moments that my global consciousness and my belief in the power of people-led revolutions began to grow. What truly changed and shaped my trajectory in life, however, was the Sudanese revolution of 2019. It was the feeling associated with finally seeing that it was my people's time to revolt, that it was my family and friends protesting, that our flags waved proud and high, and that the streets of my childhood filled with the song of resistance. Yet the fall of Umar al-Bashir in April of 2019 was not the end of our revolution, but rather the beginning of an even longer struggle towards liberation from the military powers that had hijacked our attempts at democratization. On June 3rd of 2019, the military in Sudan violently dispersed the sit-in that had been taking place in front of its headquarters since the fall of al-Bashir. Hundreds of people were massacred. Tents burned to the ground, bodies thrown into the Nile, and an internet and communications blackout was imposed. It was in that context that my family arrived in Sudan that year. And on June 30th, I attended my very first protest on the streets of Sudan. There's something very different about the nature of protests in the West, where there's a semblance of free speech, and in Sudan, where soldiers not only hold the free rein to shoot with impunity, but rather relish the moment they are given the order to pull the trigger and kill you in cold blood for your defiance. It was that difference that solidified my resolve and commitment to the Sudanese cause. Because you see, when we live in societies where we are not directly threatened by oppression, we bear a moral responsibility to uplift the voices of the voiceless, of those who give their lives for the sake of change. I left Sudan that summer, having witnessed the first transitional government in over 30 years in the nation. But soon, things took a turn for the worse, with COVID exacerbating political and economic and social crises. In the summer of 2021, I lost 3 of my closest family members. Both of my grandfathers, who had been sources of inspiration my entire life, who inspired my love of history and culture, and my cousin Ubay, who was the older brother I'd never had. The former two, due to the virtually collapsed healthcare infrastructure in Sudan, and the latter, brutally murdered in Khartoum. That fall, I began my junior year in a haze. I wasn't sure how to comprehend the magnitude of loss and how to interpret what revolution meant anymore. I didn't know how to keep fighting when all of these feelings of hopelessness and desolation threatened to pull me under. That changed in October of 2021, though, when the military in Sudan overthrew its civilian counterparts. An internet and communications blackout was imposed once again, and the only words I was left with were the words of my politically active aunt, who told me right before the blackout to get the word out of what was happening in Sudan. Suddenly, resistance and revolution were no longer this choice or a source of pride, but rather an obligation that I bore to my family and to my people. And so, I threw myself into organizing alongside the small Boston Sudanese community. We hosted and gained the sense of strength from our collective grief and anger. We hosted protests and information sessions, and amongst ourselves, discussions of what our future of democracy could possibly look like in Sudan. It was in these spaces that I found my own calling to resistance in the capacity of university. And for me, that was rewriting Sudan's story, one that was often portrayed through the lens of conflict and poverty, through the lens of academia instead. Between my junior and senior years, I dedicated my time to the research and understanding of Sudan's democratic context and its history. And in March of this past year, I submitted my senior thesis to the Harvard Government Department entitled Dictating Democracy, the struggle for freedom, peace, and justice through the rise and fall of democracy in post-independent Sudan. Today, my work marks one of the most comprehensive pieces of academic literature ever written on the democratic tradition in Sudan. And it was through this journey of research, of rediscovering my own rich history, that I found my dedication to resistance and my passion for change once again. So when the war in Sudan broke out between its armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces on April 15th of this year, I knew that it was, and resounding global silence followed, I knew that it was my responsibility to speak out, because if I didn't, no one else would. This meant spreading awareness of what was happening in Sudan, fundraising for medical relief in the nation, writing op-eds, speaking to US government officials on the plight of my people, and writing a spoken word on the situation for my affinity graduation from Harvard, the speech that went viral and led me to the stage today. Yet, as I stand before you, the situation remains unchanged. We are now 7 months into the Sudanese war, and the death toll in my nation has topped 12,000. That's a number that doesn't even include those massacred by the genocide occurring in Darfur right now. The number of people currently displaced in Sudan tops 7 million, making it both the fastest growing and largest internal displacement crisis in the world. The humanitarian situation is quite literally catastrophic. Over 19 million children are out of school. More than 50% of the nation, that's 24 million people, require humanitarian assistance. Over 70% of the nation's hospitals are out of commission. And there are dire shortages of food and water and medication everywhere. The UN originally estimated $2.6 billion required to meet the level of basic humanitarian assistance in Sudan at the beginning of conflict. Today, 7 months into the crisis, and as it worsens every single day, the global community has pooled together to barely meet a third of that need. But make no mistake, The world may not care for us, but we will do the work ourselves to save our people. Today, the rise in global repression and in the nature of autocratic governments everywhere cannot be denied. In nations formerly considered to have fathered human rights, those considered to be model democracies, the veil of freedom crumbles along with the legacy of imperialism as people begin to grow in consciousness. Because despite the amount of power that the leaders of these nations hold, it is still people power that frightens them. It is the marches and protests in solidarity with Palestine and the calls for a ceasefire. It is the waving of the Palestinian flag and the wearing of the kufiya. They resort to lies and violence and incarceration in the face of our chance for peace and our proof of the truth. Your voice matters. It shatters their illusion of control. Your voice matters because at the end of the day, a regime, no matter how repressive it may be, is subject to the whims of its population. No matter where you live, no matter what your nation's stance may be, your voice of dissent is one that terrifies oppressors and is one that gives the resistance hope. And so, I stand here today to share my story and to teach you what I have learned through my work. These lessons are as follow. 1, embrace the grief and let it be your drive. Allow loss to anger and to motivate you. Remember their names and their stories and work to honor their memory. 2, though it should not be the burden of the oppressed to advocate for themselves, in the world that we live in, it is. If we do not put our traumas on display, bombard you with the images of starving African children, of women fleeing war, of buildings in rubble, and of children's ligaments torn apart by bombs, people cannot be brought to care. 3, platforms matter, as does your voice, especially at a time when free speech no longer appears to be a right, and when people are vilified and demonized for their calls for justice and human rights. 4, silence is complicity. Solidarity is a verb, and our liberation is ultimately intertwined. From Sudan to Palestine to the Congo and elsewhere, those who oppress us are one, and those vested in our oppression are one. And none of us are free until all of us are free. So, utilize your voice however you can. It may not be chanting in the streets. Your resistance may be research, it may be art, it may be fundraising, it may be negotiations and lobbying. But no matter what it is, take action. We are the youth, the upcoming generation, and this world's only hope at establishing a more just society. We are the first generation this world has seen that visibly bears witness to all of its oppression. We cannot be the ones to let it continue. Thank you.